still the place to be on Wednesday mornings at 10 o'clock in Grinnell, Iowa. And thank you to so many of you for turning out on this not so great morning. I'm still not Janet Carl. I'm still Barb Leese. Janet's actually back from her warm place, but she had another appointment this morning. So I'm very happy to be able to do the introduction again since I introduced Dr. Queathem's first part of the course. I'm thrilled to be able to introduce her for the second part. Before we get started, here are the things you need to know. Masks are welcome but not required. Please silence your cell phones. Turn on your T-coil if you have one. If there's time for questions, there'll be 2 people with mics. They'll come around, speak directly into the microphone. Coffee and cookies cost about $2 a person. If you're able, please consider putting a little money in the big green bucket on the refreshment table. If you're able, please put your chair up after the program on the dollies provided. There's 2 up here and there's 2 in the back, I think. Now for the main event. Last week, Dr. Liz Queathem of Grinnell College's biology department invited us to take a hard look at the global problem of climate change and ask ourselves how we arrived at this point and what is or is not being done to address it. This week, in the second part of her course, What Do We Really Owe the Future? Nature, Community, and the Climate Emergency. Dr. Queathem will show us what climate change looks like in our state and in our local community, and how we can address, and in some cases are addressing, this crucial issue. Please join me in welcoming back Dr. Liz Queathem.
Thank you, and thanks to everybody who turned out for this. I was really worried about the ice this morning, so I salute your bravery. So I thought I would try to tackle 4 different things today. First, what do most people actually think about climate change? That's on. Sorry, I forgot how to use this. That's okay. You guys can read. I know you can. So what do people mostly think about climate change? I wanted to tell you something about what Grinnell College is doing to address this problem. I wanted to talk a little bit about what's in this new bill that was just signed this past year. And then finally, I wanted to leave plenty of time for us to discuss what it's possible for us as individuals to do. Because I feel like this is such a huge problem. It's really easy to feel overwhelmed. So I wanted us to have time to think about concrete steps and what might be easy. But first, I wanted to address a question that I was asked for which I had absolutely no answer whatsoever. So that was kind of embarrassing last week. And the question was, well, if greenhouse gases trap energy inside the atmosphere, why don't they bounce off when they hit the atmosphere? Like, what is it about that atmospheric barrier that causes them to become trapped? And it turns out that this is all about the different molecules of gases that make up the atmosphere and how they respond when they get hit with these electromagnetic waves. It turns out that oxygen and nitrogen don't respond to infrared electromagnetic radiation, and this just shows you that the wavelengths are different for different parts of the spectrum. And infrared has longer wavelengths than like blue light. So it's only some molecules that respond to that. And the way that they respond is that when it hits them, they absorb the infrared energy and then they emit it again. And when they do that, they do it in every direction, right? We don't care about the stuff that goes out into space, but some of it comes back towards the Earth. So it's actually not the case that they only reflect it toward the Earth, but it's that part that we have to be concerned about. So thank you for asking that question and educating me, because I was not aware of exactly the physics of how this works. So I wanted to start off here by showing you some data about what people think when we ask them questions about climate change. And you hear a lot about how horrible social media are. This is a case where social media was used for good. So these data come from Facebook. And they did a questionnaire, and they just asked people who were Facebook users, do you think climate change is going to harm you a great deal? And you can see, you know, the darker and more blue the color is, the more people felt that they would be harmed by climate change a lot. And you can see that this varies a lot if you look across the face of the globe. Not surprisingly, people who live in Russia are like, yes, please make it warmer, right? Not that they won't suffer from it too, but like, you can like relate to that, right? People in the US are for the most part not that worried. But people who live in the tropics, and especially in Central and South America and parts of South Asia and the tropics, are very concerned, and rightly so. If you look at how many people think in the United States that global warming is happening, this is broken down, in this case by county. And so you can see that there are different counties in Iowa, right? And basically it's often places where there are high population densities that people believe more strongly that this is happening. Oops, sorry. And then people on the coasts, of course. People in California, southern Texas, who are feeling the effects of this most strongly. So I thought that was kind of interesting. And you can see, you know, most people understand that this is happening. Not everybody is super dark red, indicating that they're up in the 85% range, but hardly anybody is blue anymore, right? So here's how this falls out. And this is from a survey from 2021, so more recent survey. So 72% of all people think that it is happening. 14% think that it is not. 57% think it's caused mostly by human activities. 30% do not. 57% believe that most scientists think global warming is happening. And this one I find kind of depressing. Like, why do they think that they know that it's happening, but scientists are unaware? Right? What do they think? That's kind of, I take it kind of personally. And furthermore, what's the basis for their belief that it's happening, right? If they don't think so, most, anyway, just like my thing. But, and 64% believe that it is affecting the weather. Of course, people get their ideas about this from whatever media they watch and listen to, right? So depending on whether you're, you know, listening to Rush Limbaugh or NPR, you're going to have different opinions about this probably. Just as you tend to seek out sources of news that agree with whatever you already think. We don't like to feel like we're stupid. That's why that one question bothered me so much. No. I just don't want people to think I'm stupid. So here, this just shows you how this has changed tremendously over time, right? So starting in 2009, you can see the green means that most scientists think global warming is happening. Black means there's a lot of disagreement. These were kind of neck and neck up until maybe 2012, 2013. And after that, this clear change began to take place. And increasingly, people are acknowledging that most scientists agree that climate change is real and that it's happening. But there are some real diehards down here who are fixed in that belief, right? That is not going to change. Now, there are only 1 in 5 Americans, so about 20% of all people, who fully understand that not only do scientists understand this, but almost all scientists understand this, like more than 90% of all scientists, and have come to believe that this is true just based on the scientific evidence. And in fact, 97% of all actively publishing climate scientists agree that humans are causing this. Like, not just that it's happening, but that we're responsible for it. If you went to 100 doctors and 97 of them told you that you should do one thing and the other 3 told you you should do the other thing, like what would you do, right? You would not go with the 3% in that case. Now, how much harm do people think we're going to suffer from climate change? I'm going to try this one more time. Oh, maybe the battery's out. Okay, it is on. Yeah, it's blinking like with a little empty battery thing, maybe. I'm going to ask my tech support to look at this. But so 65% of people are worried about global warming. And even more people think it'll harm plants and animals. It'll harm future generations. Again, you have to wonder about that. Like 6% of people who know that it's going to harm future generations, but they don't care. Like, they're not worried about it. I don't know. People believe that it will harm people in developing countries. A smaller percentage believe that it will harm people in the US, but they don't think it's going to hurt them, right? It's this weird sort of optimism that people possess, where they just don't think that it will happen to them. However, they understand that it is already harming people in the United States, a majority anyway. But the same percentage have personally already experienced the effects of global warming or believe that they have done so, as believe that it will harm. So basically, unless it's already hurt you, you don't think it's going to happen to you, right? What do people think we should be doing to combat this problem? Well, everybody thinks we should fund research into renewable energy sources, right? And that makes sense. It's a no-brainer. There's actually strong support for regulating CO2 and setting limits on how much CO2 power plants are allowed to produce, which is interesting because to get to that higher percentage, it has to cross party lines, right, and political boundaries. A lot of people think we should make fossil fuel companies pay a carbon tax. So that suggests that people understand that fossil fuels are the main problem that has caused this blossoming of greenhouse gas production. A lot of people think we should require utilities to produce at least 20% electricity from renewable sources. And we should get tax rebates for things that we do to combat climate change. I was kind of relieved to see this because this is the exact opposite, right, of what we should be doing, drilling for oil in places that are currently restricted, and neither should we really be expanding offshore drilling. So again, this is just to highlight how strong the support for funding research into renewables is. Everybody thinks we should be doing this, right? And that makes perfect sense because we are optimists and we're hopeful that we can find technologies that can help us deal with this. We have technologies now, right, that will help us deal with this. But if we could get something like cold fusion, that would be a game changer. It'd be incredible. So who should be responsible for addressing global warming? 70% of people think corporations should be doing this. And that makes a certain amount of sense because factories and, energy companies and so on, they're producing a lot of the stuff that, like, relative to individuals like us, they're producing more of those emissions. But only a little over half of all people think the president should be doing more. 61% say Congress should do more. Governor, local officials, and citizens. Like, this kind of surprised me. People are like, yes, I think I need to step up, and people like me. Although it's possible that everybody thought somebody else should be doing it, right? Like, that we can't rule that out. But I thought this was kind of weird, that only 55% of all people thought that this should be a high priority for the next president and Congress. And I think here, everybody's afraid that this is going to affect the economy, right? And that's a problem. We have, problems with inflation right now, so people are worried about that. Who's going to pay for it? If you ask, again, kind of take apart who thinks fossil fuel companies are responsible for this, it breaks down kind of the way that you might expect along, in part partisan lines, right? So this is broken down by county, but if we broke it down by congressional districts, I think you'd see a very similar pattern. So people who live in the South don't think of it that way as much. People who live on the coast or in the farther South understand that this is a problem. And people in Alaska totally get that because it's happening faster, right, in the North and in the far South. Now, there's been changes over time in people, how many people think this should be a high priority for the president and Congress. And again, you can see that for both Democrats and independents, this was relatively low. For Republicans, it's quite low. Republicans have mostly stayed the same, but Democrats, this has changed a lot, and it's increased somewhat, but not a ton for independents. So there's been some movement on this, but not for everybody. And again, I think this is going to depend in part, on where you get your information and how important you think that is. Now, this kind of made me sad. The number of people who discuss global warming at least occasionally is only 35%. And that's at least ever, right? At least occasionally. So most people are not talking about it, even though they recognize that it's important. And part of me understands that because it's kind of a bummer, and is it just going to come up over coffee? Like, you're probably going to talk about your kids or your grandkids or something, right? And only 33% of all people say that they hear about global warming in the media at least once a week. And that did surprise me because people are interested in news stories about global warming. So 74% were interested in news stories about global warming. And again, this covers the whole United States, above 50% interested. So you might think they would notice when stories about this popped up. On the one day that I was working on this, oops, wait a minute. Oh, that's weird. Okay. There we go. So, in the New York Times on the 18th, there were 3 stories about global warming just on that one day. And then there were other stories that mentioned it in passing. In the Des Moines Register, over this 3-day period, there were 3 stories about global warming. So I was like, come on, man. But I think when people see a story about biodiversity or about G20 or about, what's happening in California with the drought and the wildfires, they might not understand that that is actually a story about climate change. The newspaper understands this. I found these by doing a search in the newspaper, right? So if you search for climate change, all of these articles will pop up. But of course, most of us just read the paper, right? We don't search for particular topics. So what about Iowans? Well, we're pretty close to what other people think. Our percentages were a little bit lower than the national percentages for is it happening, caused by humans, do scientists think it's happening, but a similar pattern. The map shows you how many people in Iowa think that global warming will harm them personally. And I thought this might be a little bit higher after the derecho, but no. And in all fairness, we've always had storms here, right? And this is what's so sneaky about climate change. You'll just get more of the bad stuff for the most part. In Florida, you might say, well, we've always had some floods. Yeah, but not like this. So that makes it hard because of the way that we perceive risk intellectually to understand how bad it could be. But people in Iowa are worried about global warming. They understand that it will harm plants, animals, and future generations and developing countries. To a lesser degree, people in the U.S. and so on. Right? Now, here, these are people who, in the black, who disagree with the statement that they have personally experienced the effects of global warming. These are the people who say that they have personally experienced the effect of global warming. And you can see that these numbers are converging and crossing over. So as we have, even though the number of people who believe that they personally will be harmed is not as high, I would say it should be pushing 100%, really, ultimately. Well, depending on, it's less harm for me than for my kids because they're going to live farther into the future. So that could be a factor here as well. But you can see these lines are at the point where they're starting to cross. So at some level, people are understanding that climate change is responsible for some of the horrific climate events that we see. Everybody wants tax rebates. That is a no-brainer, right? I was heartened by this. People believe that schools should teach about global warming. So for some reason, this has not made it into some of the culture war stuff, or it had not, at least at the time of this. It was not really controversial. Again, Iowans also think we should fund research into renewable energy sources. And again, for all of these things, very similar to the numbers that we saw at the level of the entire country. So we're not unusual as Americans in our beliefs. And we believe that there are actions that should be taken. But again, we're not talking about it, right? You guys are not in this category because you came to 2 talks in a week. High five. But, so people are not seeing it and they're not talking about it, broadly speaking, for the most part. And again, here you can see at the bottom who people think should do more about global warming. Mostly they want corporations to do it, and citizens, but realistically, to make it affordable for citizens and compulsory for corporations, corporations are not in business to build a better world for the future as far as climate is concerned. They have a duty to their shareholders to make money, right? They're not going to do this unless Congress and the president and the governor, unless somebody tells them that they have to do it, right? If somebody had not made a law that we had to have seat belts in cars, we'd all be flying through windshields every time we, hit another car. Again, we're doing a ton about this in Iowa. Look at all those wind power projects. It's phenomenal. At the college, I can tell you that about 15 years ago, some of us at the college came to President Kington. Was that about 15 years ago? Something like that. Right after he had come here. And we said, we would like you to do 3 things. First, sign the American College and University President's Climate Commitment. Second, start a wind turbine project that the college will benefit from. And 3, set up an office of sustainability. And he said, I will do 2 of those things. And he did the 2 that were most important. But when we asked the Board of Trustees to support this wind turbine project, they said, there's never going to be wind south of about here. You know, it's just, otherwise there would already be turbines there. And through an unfortunate series of events, we ended up missing out on the opportunity to have a 3-turbine wind project for the college. And there was much wailing and gnashing of teeth. I was sad. But we've rebounded from that, fortunately. So lots of wind in Iowa. And this means that no matter how you feel about, climate change, this is good for Iowa. So you're going to be in favor of more wind power because we build those turbines. If you look at how much of the energy in Iowa comes from renewables, it's more than half. This is fabulous because you and I haven't had to do a thing. This is the greening of the grid, right? 57% of all of our energy comes from wind. We don't have a ton. This 2% is mostly solar. And you can see we're not where we could be with solar, but we're increasing. And we could provide 20% of all of the energy that we need in Iowa if we just stuck solar panels on every rooftop everywhere. And some places do this. Like if you've ever gone to, southern New Mexico or Germany, you just see a ton of rooftop solar panels. And Des Moines has actually pledged to lower the city's greenhouse gas emissions and become completely carbon-free by 2035. And given how fast the grid is changing, this is not unrealistic at all. So that's good news, right? Lots of cities are jumping on this bandwagon, but that includes the biggest city in Iowa. So that's pretty exciting. So stand up or not. If you're not comfortable moving around, just find a discussion partner. And I would just like to know what surprised you the most about these slides, or were you completely unsurprised by them? So just discuss that with each other for a few minutes. Okay, I think I'm going to cut you off a little bit short so that people can report out. I know it's better than listen to me blab, but don't worry, there will be more chances to discuss in a few minutes. But also, it's almost time for our 10-minute break. So, what did you guys think? Were you surprised? Raise your hand if you were surprised. Yeah. Raise your hand if you were completely unsurprised. Most people are reluctant to raise their hands. Yeah, so Joan, tell me, what surprised you the most about it?
Well, I don't know how they ask the questions, but I think everybody who has grandchildren must know their grandchildren are going to be affected.
Yeah,
You know, so how can they answer they're not going to be affected? You know,
right. Yeah, that is perplexing, definitely.
and I don't know. I've been working on keeping my carbon footprint small for about 70 years, and you know, I mean, when I had a car, it was a
Ooh, that was a
efficient-
power move. Did you hear that? When I had a car. She's gone car free.
But people are buying, you know, big cars, big houses, you know, live in huge apartments and houses.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah. What about somebody who was totally, oh yeah, Kent.
I found the 57% wind power in Iowa a surprising thing. I didn't think it was that fast.
And in a good way, right? Yeah.
I noticed that on CBS News, the local news, every night now they're putting up a chart that shows that day how much they had energy from wind, from sun, the percentage, and you might look at that.
Wow.
And so they do like 3 days to compare the days. When there's no sun, obviously the percentage goes down. And so I think that's a good thing. Again, it's making them aware without preaching.
That's brilliant. Yeah, and you know, when the sun isn't shining, the wind is often blowing, at least in Iowa.
I was particularly caught by the chart indicating the concern between, and I hate to say it this way, but it's what I saw, is that Republicans as a group tend very much to say, forget it. But I was a little surprised to see the independents in the middle, rather clearly in the middle. The Democrats, yes, over the years have pushed for things. I sometimes wonder how much of our problems in doing anything about it is that we continue to make it a political piece of information rather than getting more information out about the reality of it. Iowa using 57% green energy at the present time. I doubt there are many in Iowa who have any idea that that's the amount that's being used.
Yeah, and we
There,
should be
a lot
proud.
of it, it seems to me, is tied up in how we distribute information and how much we get together. We distribute information by political view, not by real solid information.
Yeah, and that's a really serious problem. It's possible to spread disinformation now so effectively, and it's becoming easier. So that's a serious problem, and we need to think about that. But some of it, too, can be a philosophical difference, where you might say, well, either you can be really optimistic and say, we've engineered our way out of every other problem. I believe in American exceptionalism, and I think we're going to do it with this one, too, right? That might be one reason why someone might not be worried about climate change. Yeah.
I wanted to point out that the question about have you personally been affected by climate change, you even assumed that meant have I been hurt by
Yes.
climate change. And in the short term, as you point out, people in Russia might say, hey, this is good, right? And we've seen here in Iowa, I've lived here for 30 years, I've seen, you know, the fall stay warmer longer and the spring come earlier, and, you know, things, and it's good in the short term, but to understand that these changes, whatever these changes are, they bring the potential for really bad things, as well as, you know, some good things. Nothing is always one way.
Yeah. No, that's a great point. I mean, it's great to have a longer growing season, but if rainfall patterns are also changing so that you get torrential downpours in the spring and then droughts in the summer, you're not going to benefit from that longer growing season. Yes, and yes,
The pests that survive longer and are more of a problem.
that's right. Yeah, good. Okay, I think we should take our regular break now. But maybe, well, I don't know. Do people want the full 10 minutes? Go for it.
Okay, so we'll return a little before, 10:50 or something. I'll ring the
Or
bell. I'll ring
10:45.
the bell. Okay,
Oh, right,
10:45.
10:50. I'm sorry,
10:45.
my watch is just ahead. So I just wanted to take to show you some of the slides that Chris Bear and I put together. He and I co-chair the Sustainability Planning Committee at the college, and the trustees became interested in climate change a few years ago when students occupied Nolan House to ask the trustees to divest from fossil fuels. And so now we have a formal committee and we give them an update at least once a year. The college has not, by the way, divested from fossil fuels. So we can't take advantage of tax credits because we're a nonprofit, right? So we don't pay taxes in the same way, but we're partnering with people who can benefit from those tax credits and then signing contracts to purchase all of the energy from their solar project. So this is 16th, and we're looking west. This is a solar project that's been installed just north of 16th. It's going to produce almost a third of all the electricity that we use on campus and offset 18% of our emissions. We're using a battery for peak shaving, which is when you reduce your load at times when demand is high and you get charged more money for the power you use. And the project has been complete for, I believe, literally months, and we're just waiting for Alliant to sign off on the final, paperwork before we can flip the switch. So that's huge, very exciting, and didn't cost the college a penny, whereas if we had built those wind turbines, we would have been responsible for the cost and the upkeep and so on, whereas solar panels don't have any moving parts, so they don't usually require a lot of maintenance. Ice, the sun comes through the ice and the solar panels are dark, so it melts really quickly. We have solar panels in our backyard, and even when it snows, it doesn't stay on the panels for very long. Ice doesn't hurt them. They were fine during the derecho. Hail doesn't bother them. They're very sturdy. I'd like to get them on my roof just to protect my roof. Like, we've had to replace the roof 3 times, right? So, because of hailstorms, so. Out at the Conard Environmental Research Area, we have a really nice building called the Environmental Education Center, and we're getting solar panels installed out there as well. The building, I'm sorry I didn't include a picture of the building, but if you've ever been to events out at Sierra, you've seen it. It was the first LEED Gold building in Iowa, and now it's going to be our first net zero building. So it will be drawing no power whatsoever from the grid. So we're very excited about that as well. And there's a project that looks like it's moving forward with the city and Alliant Energy, so this is that part of town where we thought about putting a new school there, and then they did the soil samples, and the soil was really dirty, and people went back and forth. They're gonna put solar panels there now. And so the city is setting this up with Alliant Energy. I predict it'll go a lot faster because Alliant will be making money off this one instead of losing money to it. But that was just snarky me, like just, So, and this will provide another 16% of our electricity. The college will need to purchase however much of this land they need in order to get that much energy. And then Alliant would lease the land and develop the solar project, and there would be a 25-year lease. So that's another project that we're super excited about.
The first project on 16th Street.
Oh, I wish I could answer that question for you, but I do not remember.
That's a lot bigger than 16 acres, huh? It's about twice that, yeah, that's what it looks like.
Yeah,
What the other one does.
yeah. So, and this one, I don't, yeah. Yeah, this project is much smaller. It would only provide half as much electricity as the first one that we looked at. So, and then, of course, I showed you a slide earlier about this that showed how much renewable energy Iowa has. And this is showing just for Alliant. So, because of course, not everybody in Iowa gets their energy from Alliant. But you can see in 2005, they only had 5% of their energy coming from renewables. By 2021, it was 34%. By 2030, it will be 54%. And I think that this is in part because people have made such a stink about where their energy is coming from. Like, we bought solar panels and put them in our backyard, and now we're paying less money to Alliant Energy. And I think when places do that and people do that, it can have an effect, right? I mean, and in addition, they can read the writing on the wall, right? Everybody understands now that this is a problem. The college has also been in the process of converting the central HVAC, the heating and cooling plant, from traditional formats to geothermal. So we've put in a whole bunch of geothermal wells in Ward Field. And you can't even tell they're there now. It was a mess for a while while they were installing them. But people play ultimate frisbee and stuff out on the lawn just like they always did. And this is, I'm sorry, it's under Macfield, but it's expandable to the east, so we could add more later. So we're gradually upgrading our heating and cooling to geothermal. And the way that works is that underground, it's always 55 degrees. So in the winter, if you can run stuff down there and bring it up to 55 degrees before you have to heat it the rest of the way, that saves a lot of energy. Same thing in the summer, if you need to cool it, if you take it down there and get it down to 55, So that's going to be a huge energy saver for us. And in addition, it can all be run using pumps that are electrical, right? So that means that we can use the solar panels, that are providing us with power to help run the geothermal stuff. So this is going to be a huge help on into the future. And this field provides energy for multiple buildings on campus. So not just the new Humanities and Social Studies complex, but other buildings as well. Students have really spearheaded efforts to reduce waste and increase composting. So we have a food waste audit coming up, and we're working on composting. Composting has been a bit of a moving target because we're also trying to find, we need commercial composters because we have compostable plates and forks for some events that need, things like that. And you have to get it really hot to actually make those compost. And so there are some composters who won't take those, but we think we have found somebody who's willing to give it a shot. We're trying to waste less food, so we're doing an audit in the dining hall. If you give people big trays, they put more food on them without being aware. I know, right? You shock me. Professor Queathem, how many PhDs did it take to figure that out? Yeah, and so we have these giant trays in the dining hall, and everything is designed to work with those trays. So people are wasting a lot of food, and so we need to find ways that we can reduce that and just have people take the amount that they will actually eat. And then students have a thing called the Thing Swap. And they do this once a month. I encourage you to go over, bring your stuff, and see if there's anything you want. You just bring things that you don't want anymore, and you put it in JRC 101 between 12 and 4 p.m. on a Sunday afternoon. And then if you see anything you want, you take it. If, you leave your stuff there. And then what's left over goes to the thrift store at the end. It's really fun. And one of my favorite photos of one of my students, who was my tutorial student, she got a Batman mask at the thing swap. It was a good look for her. It was really excellent. I bet she still has that mask. And then end of year waste, we also collect stuff that students leave behind that is not just junk, because of course students can't afford to take everything home with them. And then we've in the past made it available to students through a flea market during fall of the next year, or we can send it to thrift stores. We're currently trying to figure out how much carbon we sequester just with the landscapes that we have on campus. How does our landscape affect our carbon footprint? And then how do landscapes and green space affect wellness? People have published scientific papers that demonstrate that if you go to the hospital for an operation and you are in a room where you can see a tree out the window, you get well faster than if you are in a room where you do not have that view. Like, there are really concrete and measurable wellness effects to having nature available to you. And so we want to think about what those might be. And then we're engaged in a campus tree mapping project. There's a tool called iTree that you put all the trees that you have into this software, and then it tells you what are the monetary benefits of having those trees there in your community. How much are you getting in terms of reduced amount you have to spend on air conditioning because they're shading houses? How much are you getting because they help water infiltrate into the soil so you don't have flooding? How much carbon are they sequestering? It's different depending on what kind of tree they are. What kind of wildlife are they supporting? What kinds of birds? Squirrels, other kinds of animals, insects. So we developed a tree map of campus. This is kind of ugly, but I took it off my phone. I had a student working with me who went through and identified every tree on the college campus to species and used ArcGIS software to map where it was. Many years ago, the Center for Prairie Studies, I think, did this thing where they made a tree map, like a paper tree map, that showed where all the trees were on campus, so you could walk around and look at all the different trees and then know what they were if you had this map with you, and you could identify them because there were also these leaf outlines that showed you what the leaves looked like. So we're going to do an updated version of this for campus, and in addition, we want to make it a digital arboretum. So you can you can pull up this map on your phone, and you don't have to know how to use ArcGIS to do this. It would just be like on the college website, and you just click on it. And then you can it'll show you where you are, just like Google Maps does, and then you can see what the tree is that you're looking at. Right? So we're excited about this project just because anything you can do to make people more aware of these things, it helps people to think about nature and plant more trees and think about what's the value of trees. We also had a class develop sustainability signage that will highlight the stuff that we do on campus that is invisible because it's underground or it's inside a building, as well as the things that are visible. So there's this series of maps, or signs rather, and so you can do a little sustainability tour of campus. And it explains what it is that you're looking at. So like by Mack Field, it shows you what geothermal wells look like, that you can't see them because they're underground, but you know they're there. We're trying to make sustainability more prominent on our website so that students who are looking for a place to go to college know what kinds of things they can do here. And then you can also do this sustainability tour on the website if you're not in Grinnell, and go through and look at all those different places on campus. So it'll explain all of these things to you, on your phone or on your computer if you're somewhere else and not on campus, but you want to know about them. And then we're trying to have spaces where we can teach classes outdoors. So Tara Shukla recently taught a class that was about botanical drawing and its social origins. So that's what students are doing here. My husband teaches a class called The Sex Lives of Plants, very racy. That's what's happening over here. And then Andrew Graham teaches an aquatic geochemistry class, and they're out at Sierra in this image. But so using campus as a classroom and studying the actual things that are on campus. We have several prairie sites on campus now. One that students put together, or maybe this is one actually, this might be up by the athletic fields, but students actually had a student initiative to install not just prairie plants, but a planned prairie garden that was designed by the guy who's done design work for the Des Moines Botanical Center. Because sometimes when you install a prairie garden, you walk by it a year later, it hasn't been weeded. People are like, what are all those weeds doing there? And so he tried to plan it intentionally so that there wouldn't be a bunch of big floppy plants on the edges that would like flop over onto the sidewalk and so on. And then our president, I'm really proud of this one, Anne wanted, as part of her inauguration, to have another prairie planting on campus. And so the college paid to have another prairie planting put in. So we're trying to support animals like monarch butterflies and goldfinches by having more natural spaces on campus. And then we have additional outdoor learning spaces. I was on the landscaping committee that was in charge of figuring out what to do with that space between the humanities building and Noyce. And we put in a bunch of outdoor learning spaces. It's a nice place to just go and hang out. There are all these chalkboards there. And we did this, not knowing, of course, that this would happen right before the pandemic. These were the only spaces where you could teach and be with students, right? Because it was not safe to be with them indoors, like in the early days before we knew exactly how well masks would work and so on. So that's my dog, Ochre. I just took this picture because I loved what somebody wrote on this chalkboard. I have no idea who did this or what they were thinking, but I felt like, this is a sentiment that we should all hear more often. So we're doing our best. The trustees know that their primary responsibility is fiduciary. They want to make sure that the college will still be there in 20 years. So they only want to do things about climate change for the most part that are budget neutral. And that has been a stumbling block for us. But they've been amazingly interested in what's going on. And, they're more interested in these, and I understand that fiduciary responsibility. I want the college to be there in 20 years too, but so they've been really good about helping us think about ways that we can do things about climate change while still being responsible with the finances of the college. Because we don't want to say to students, oh, we're doing all this great stuff, but now your tuition is $3,000 more because, we decided to, build wind turbines or whatever. So this was where I was thinking we would have a break. Okay, I'm going to keep going. We're going to have another break in just a little bit. So how bad is climate change really? Like I showed you some really scary pictures last week. And, the news is not great. There's 3 ways that you can deal with climate change. You can just quit producing greenhouse gases, and ideally we would remove some of what we have already added. Adaptation, find a way to live with the changes that we will not have control over. But an important, and you might think of this as part of adaptation, a key element here is going to be resilience. So we need to change the way that we build things and do things so that when bad things occur, they won't hurt us as badly and we can recover swiftly, right? And then that might include planting trees that will do well here in the climate that will exist here in 20 years instead of the climate we have now. Or looking and asking which trees suffered the most in the derecho and asking the hard question, do we want to replace those with the same species? Or do we want to plant species that will bend more in the wind and not snap off partway up? Right. This is a lot. I'm sorry. It's off the IPCC report that just came out in 2021, 22. And this is just to show you CO2 levels are still going up. Not in the US. We have turned the corner. But worldwide, they are still going up. And you can see most of it is from fossil fuels. There's other stuff that has to do with the way that we do agriculture and graze animals and, tear down forests. You can see methane by itself is huge. And that's the problem with natural gas. It's clean burning, but you release methane when you try to get it. Nitrous oxide, also a really bad problem. And then fluorinated gases of the types that we use in refrigerants and so on. So, this is not great. But the shaded area indicates the uncertainty in these estimates. I'm not going to go into details about what LULUCF is because I don't know. But you can see, they recognize we don't know exactly how much these things are going to change in the future, and we haven't measured them completely accurately necessarily. CO2 we have. And that's why the error is so small on this. So if you look at regions, you might say, oh, darn it, people live in East Asia. They need to buckle up and quit producing all that CO2. Here's North America, Latin America, Southeast Asia, and so on. And it's true, right now, East Asia is producing more CO2 than North America. But if you look, all the CO2 that we put into the atmosphere in the past is still there. So if you look at our historical emissions, then what you see is that North America and Europe are responsible for a lot. Some from fossil fuel and industry, some from land use decisions. So we do have a really big responsibility, even if we're not the biggest gorilla in the room anymore. And if you ask per capita how much we're producing, you can see, we are the kings, right? Per person, our carbon footprint is enormous compared to most other countries. I think there are a few countries in the Middle East that have a higher footprint, but for the most part, here's Southeast Asia, the Pacific over here, South Asia, Eastern Asia. We're really doing worse in terms of per person what we're responsible for. So that's an issue. But there's a lot of ways that we can fix this, and I'm sorry this is so complicated, but this is a big figure that says what are our options, what are their costs, and how much good would they do? So what are their potential contributions to net emission reduction? Well, you can see this one is the biggest, and it's saying if we did a whole big ton of solar energy, that would do more good than anything else. You might think the second one would be wind, but it's actually reduced conversion of forests and other ecosystems. We need to stop logging forests and turning them into grazing land and places where we do mining and agriculture. Because every tree is fixing carbon all the time. And some of these things are more expensive than others. So if there's a blue bar there that tells you costs are lower than a certain standard, So wind energy and solar, compared to the benefit we get from them, costs are relatively low. But once you get above a certain level, it gets more expensive. So, and the gray bars mean that they're not really sure how much, like reducing food loss and food waste and shifting to a different way of eating. We don't know and understand the costs of that well enough to quantify it, that well. So here's the second half of that figure, and you can see all of this stuff that has to do with transportation, it actually doesn't have as big an effect as a lot of other things. So if you're going to go after what the biggest things are, then you need to look at what's producing the most emissions and what would have the biggest effect for us to do. I mean, that makes sense. So what are the top 10 ways to reduce emissions? Solar, leave forests alone, wind, learning how to sequester carbon in agriculture. And somebody asked about this last week as well. Restore ecosystems and plant forests. So this is quit cutting them down. This is put them back. Change our diets to eat less meat. Switch fuels. Reduce emissions of fluorinated gases that we use for refrigerants. Improve forest management, and then make buildings have high energy performance. So some of these are technological. Solar, wind, fuel switching, reduce emissions of these kinds of gases, and build better buildings. But some of them, like a lot of them, involve plants, right? So quit cutting down forests, do agriculture differently so that we sequester more carbon. So things like no-till agriculture, for example, build maybe using different crops, ecosystem restoration, get new forests. I still eat meat, so I'll just out myself that way right now, but eating a vegetarian diet is much more carbon friendly, and improve forest management. So the kinds of fires that we've seen in the West, for example, we need to try to figure out how to not let those happen in part. So this is from a really great New Yorker edition that was all about climate change, where they went through the alphabet and they said something about climate change that was climate change related with each letter of the alphabet. And this might have been my favorite. So somebody asked last week again about how we can maybe genetically engineer plants so that they sequester more carbon, and people are on that. They have genetically engineered poplar trees so that they grow super fast, and to do that, they have to also fix more carbon from the air, because that's what they build themselves out of. So this was developed by a company, a biotech company in San Francisco, and they're hoping that this can be a large-scale solution to climate change. A lot of people think that we should return to doing more of our building construction from wood, because you grow trees, and then when you build things out of that wood, that carbon is still fixed in the wood, right? So that's very cost-effective in terms of carbon footprint. And this was where I was going to make everybody do the hokey pokey. We could probably, do people feel like we could skip over that? Then we'll have more time to discuss. I make my students do this. They were very enthusiastic this year, I must say. So the new Inflation Reduction Act, there's a guide in the New York Times that talks about, what it funds. Tax credits that'll cover about a third of the cost for solar panels, wind turbines, heat pumps, which are really, geothermal heat pumps. We'll look at the other kind in a second. And then storage batteries, like this Tesla Powerwall. Just regular heat pumps, which basically work like a refrigerator, but in both directions. So this is the heating cycle. So they use pressure and like a compressor to compress or allow gases to expand, and that changes whether they're heating or cooling. So this is the example of how they use in cooling, but you would just switch these cycles if you wanted. I mean, I'm sorry, this is for heating, but you would, if it was hotter outside than in the house, you would just switch the cycles, so the hot stuff would be out here and the cold stuff would be in there. So very clever. And again, driven by electricity, right? So if you also have solar panels to run this, then you're golden. Tax credits covering 1/3 of the cost for energy efficient appliances of every description, as well as things like insulation, doors, and windows that are very high efficiency. This High Efficiency Electric Home Rebate Act can provide a lot of rebates as well. So rebates for 50% of the cost and installation of renovations that reduce energy use. That's pretty sweet. Some rebates that differ depending on whether you're low income or moderate income, but 100% rebates for energy efficient upgrades if you are a low income household. So things like, appliances, insulation, electric ovens, and so on. New breaker boxes that'll make it possible for you to use these things. If you're moderate income, 50% rebates. Tax credits up to $7,500 on new electric cars. Again, there are some income restrictions on this, but they're pretty generous. So, and it's not like it used to be if you're saying, but I need to have a truck, like a big truck. Well, you can have a big truck. You can have a Ford F-150, but it runs off electricity. And now, this just makes me so happy. You can get tax credits for buying used electric vehicles. They're promoting like recycling. If somebody who's really fancy and doesn't want their old, electric car, you can buy it. The income restrictions are somewhat more restrictive on this. Don't ask me why. Shouldn't they be promoting people buying used stuff generally? Like, I don't know, whatever. I'm just happy that it's here. You can get an old Tesla even if you want. And then tax credits for 1/3 of the cost for installing an electric vehicle charger at home if you live in certain areas, like rural or low income areas. I haven't looked to see if Grinnell qualifies for this, but honestly, they're not that expensive. This is a really pretty nice one. So now, I wanted us to assort into small groups. You can stay where you are if you want. But here I've listed the things that the UN says are the top 10 things that people can do to fight climate change. Talk to other people about it, vote, and tell the people who are elected that this matters to you. Consider changing the way you get from place to place. Rein in your power use and convert to electric and solar. Tweak your diet. You don't have to become completely vegetarian if you really adore meat. Just eat more vegetables as a proportion of your diet. Shop locally, buy sustainable foods. Don't waste food, but if you do, compost it. Buy sustainable clothing brands. Go to the thrift store. I was surprised to see that 8 to 10% of global emissions actually comes from what they call fast fashion, where people expect now, like they might buy something that they're only going to wear once. At first I was like, who does that? And then I was like, wedding dresses. Like, I bought my wedding dress at Fashion Gal for $29.95. And then, I'm totally bragging here, I cut it up into pieces and used it to make a quilt for our firstborn child. So I'm totally bragging. Yeah, I saw a hand up over here.
I just wonder why you think eating meat is harder on the climate.
Why is it hard on the climate? It's in part because we tend to cut down forests around the world to create pastures where cattle can graze. And it's in part because a lot of animals, any animal that is a ruminant, like a cow, is going to produce methane. They produce methane when they burp. There are feeds now that people can feed cattle where they will produce less of that. But it's generally, more climate friendly to eat vegetables. And some animals have a higher carbon footprint than others. There are better ways to raise them and worse ways to raise them as well. Plant trees and then support planet-friendly investments. So like TIACREF is where most of my investment stuff is. They have a green investment portfolio that you can do where they'll say we're not going to invest in fossil fuels. So, and some other stuff. So for many places, that's an option for retirement investments. Okay. That's it. I want you guys to talk to each other. And if you have other questions about meat, because it's a very sensitive issue in Iowa, right? I mean, I like eating meat, and people grow meat, and people make a living from meat. There are a lot of farms in Iowa.
Hate to be this close to the end with a question, but you mentioned carbon neutral and being able to measure that. How do you measure whether or not a campus or a town or a state is carbon neutral?
Yeah, that's a great question. And they have, there's a group, it used to be called the American College and University President's Climate Commitment. Now they're called Second Nature. And they have software where you can look at the way that you spend money on stuff in the dining hall and count up how many trucks you have that are electric versus what, you collect this huge amount of data. You look at the power bills for every building on campus, and you look at how much you're spending to heat the water and and you feed all that into the computer, and then it tells you what the carbon equivalent of that is. There are places where you can do that as an individual person online and calculate your own carbon footprint. It's a huge task. And that's why the college has Chris Baer as a sustainability coordinator. And he has a whole team of students who help him collect those data. Okay, we only have a few, yeah? Questions are fine too, though.
I just have a statement. I have a nephew who works for a company that uses recyclable materials to construct their roofs, and it's an Iowa-based company, and they're doing really well. I just wanted to say that.
That's wonderful, because those roofing, if it's asphalt, those are fossil fuels, and we need stuff that's recyclable, absolutely. I just wish that was more public, because then when it hails and you need to replace your roof, you want to have that information right there. It would be great if the state would make that available.
The ethanol from corn industry in Iowa makes claims constantly that we are making carbon progress by using ethanol from corn. Do you have an opinion about that?
I've seen arguments on both sides. So for cellulosic corn, where you use not the actual corn kernels. Yeah. Supposedly about half the corn we produce in Iowa now goes to that. Growing corn the way that we grow it here requires a lot of fossil fuel inputs. So I don't know off the top of my head. I think it can be part of a solution, but I feel like it would be better if instead of replacing some of the gasoline with ethanol, like if we just fueled it in a completely different way, which is why I'm excited about electric cars. So.
One of the concerns here for me, and this happened a number of years ago, but now there's a proposal to build an ethanol plant near Grinnell, and it's the amount of water that it
Yes.
consumes. The Jordan Aquifer is going down. That's where we get our water, basically, in Grinnell. And it concerns me that it will almost double the water usage. Do you know anything about that?
Yes, that is a huge problem with ethanol plants. I mean, corn-based ethanol plants. And the water that we drink in Grinnell is fossil water, just like what you burn in your car is fossil fuels. It's drawn from the Jordan Aquifer, and it's not being replaced at the rate that we're drawing it. So at some point, it's all going to be gone. Or it'll be too expensive to pump it out. So yeah, that's a huge downside in addition.
There's a proposal in front of the city council right now to put a soybean crushing plant on the old ethanol site. And that also is a huge water user. It's going to take, many, I don't know, hundreds of thousands of gallons a day from the aquifer or from the city if that goes through.
Yeah, we really take water for granted here because we get so much rainfall here and it's very cheap. It's amazingly cheap. So it's true that there are, there's trade-offs. Sometimes there are different sustainability issues that trade off against each other, and then we just have to figure out what the costs and benefits are, I guess. But these are great points that you're raising.
Just like with the corn production, there's carbon consumed in the production of corn, and then even though the ethanol is not a carbon-based product, I think sometimes we need to consider that in all of our things. If you consider the production of batteries for EV vehicles, it is horrendous, what it costs, and then stuff. And then when you get to the end of the life, you're dealing with all these heavy metals and pollution that we don't have answers for right now. Maybe we will in time, but they're already, those things are going to come offline, and our solar panels go the same way, in the production and the disposal of those, after their life cycle goes through, how we're going to deal with those things instead of just looking, well, there's zero emissions right here, but the lead up to them and the after effect, is a big factor that I think we need to consider those things.
Yeah, and when you think about the life cycle cost of something and the embodied energy that goes into making something, including mining everything that we need in order to put it together, those are costs that we also have to consider. So, we'll need to have better recycling programs. We'll need to have better ways of mining, and we'll need to be able to figure out how to get those things back out of batteries so that we can use them again. Right now, until they become more expensive, nobody cares, right? We could be learning how to do that, but nobody has bothered. So it's true. I mean, every solution has its own costs, and so we need to think about that. But I think the bulk of what most people are thinking right now is that for now, to make progress with this clear and present problem, this is probably the best way for us to move forward, and then we'll have to figure out how to deal with those problems as they arise. But you're right. You're absolutely right. We shouldn't pretend that there are no costs to these solutions.
Thank you, Dr. Queathem. Thank you so much for being here today and last week to remind us of the global problem of climate change. Make us think about what we can do as humans and what's happening right here in our community to make a positive difference. Thank you so much. We look forward to seeing everyone next week, March 1st, when our speaker will be Eric Simpson, professor of English at Grinnell College, whose bucket course is entitled The History and Future of the Book. We look forward to seeing you then, and I'll also note that there will be a bus from Mayflower returning to Mayflower. So if you walked over and you would like a ride back, you can have a ride back. Thank you so much for coming.